questions you may have in the chat box, not the Q&A box, and please direct all those questions to the host. Jill will be reading those questions out loud during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation for those who may be joining us by phone. We will do our best to get as many questions answered as time allows. Certificates of participation in any SWCEU certificates will be emailed out next week. Time and attendance will be monitored for CEU certificates as requirements dictate full participation. A special note to all those calling into the training: if you need a participant or a CEU certificate, please email our Mid-Cumberland Regional Coordinator, Susan Cope, at susan.cope, that's C-O-P-E, at pn.gov, with your name and phone number used to call in so we can capture your participation today. So at this time, I would like to introduce Richard Kennedy, our Executive Director, to share a few words with you.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you all so very much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. As Christy said, my name is Richard Kennedy, and I have the great privilege to serve as the Executive Director of the Commission on Children and Youth. Many of you are very familiar with the work that we do at the Commission, and others of you may be newer to the work and our role. The Commission on Children and Youth is an independent state agency, and we are a part of the executive branch of state government and really serve as the broad-based children's advocacy organization in Tennessee. We focus on multi-issues ranging from the very youngest Tennesseans through the Young Child Wellness Council, through children's mental health, juvenile justice, early childhood well-being, all the way to young people who are aging out of the foster care system. So as Jen Croft would say, whatever you're passionate about, we have a role for you and an opportunity for you to engage in the advocacy work that we do through the Commission. Many of you are on this webinar by virtue of being a member of one of our 9 regional councils on children and youth, and know your local regional coordinator. Like all of you during the COVID issue and the quarantine and the pandemic, we've really had to think about and reimagine the way that we deliver the services and the work that we do. And I really want to thank all of our regional coordinators for thinking outside of the box, stepping up, and really looking at ways to maximize learning opportunities utilizing technology. Like many of you, there are and have been silver linings throughout all of this work or all of this time. And one of the silver linings for us is really realizing the importance of providing incredible training opportunities, not only for folks in certain geographic regions of the state, but statewide. So I am so appreciative of the regional coordinators, all of the work that they do every single day, but especially during this time as they continue to step up in big and small ways. So thank you for that. I also want to thank all of you who are on the call. I hope some of you have participated in previous learning opportunities, and you've heard me say that it's really important for me to thank all of you for the work that you're doing for our children, our youth, our families across the state. Not only are you accomplishing incredible work and trying in stressful times, you're just really balancing that with caring for yourself, for your families, for your communities, and it just means even more. So if no one has told you today, thank you for all that you've done. Thank you for all of the opportunities that you, or all of the times that you've stepped up in big and small ways. I want to be the one to do that. So thank you. As we introduce the webinar today, or the learning opportunity today, it really is part of a significant statewide strategy that is a public sector, private sector partnership to focus on using the ACEs science and research to really change the culture in Tennessee around how we prevent, mitigate, and help people recover from adverse childhood experiences. And so the strategy is really known as Building Strong Brains Tennessee. It is comprised of leadership from the Commission, the Department of Children's Services, the Department of Health, the Departments of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, TennCare, and then all of the countless partners that are on the other side, whether they're nonprofit organizations, service providers, funders, United Ways, just many organizations across the state. So part of the role that the Commission has taken with this effort is really taking on the public awareness, the knowledge mobilization work. And we are so incredibly fortunate to have on our staff Jen Drake Croft and Melissa McGee in no particular order other than that was an alphabetical by last name. Jen serves as our Director of Early Childhood Wellbeing and really is increasingly seen as an expert on trauma and on community organization, and just so fortunate to have her. And then Melissa McGee serves as our Director of our Council on Children's Mental Health, which is a partnership with the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services to really look at infusing systems of care, principles, and philosophies across all child-serving mental health service delivery systems. And again, Melissa just really is our in-house expert on all things mental health. So you guys are going to be in fantastic hands today. Again, I appreciate all that you do, and if there are ever opportunities that we can use to provide services or help you guys in any way, certainly do not hesitate to reach out to us. So at this point, I will stop babbling and turn over to Jen and Melissa. Thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard. And I think we are good to jump on into the deep end of the pool here. I appreciate every kind thing Richard said, other than putting Jen's name before mine, but we'll get through that. So I'm glad that you've been able to join us today. We're going to have a great day. Jen and I are really passionate about this work and the importance that it brings to children's development, and especially how well Tennessee has embraced this conversation. So we are excited to be able to share it with you. If you know me, if you have seen me talk about this in the past, then what you know is that I'm a very interactive person and I tend to use my hands a lot. And so we are trying to make this as engaging as possible. So I may give you some points to ponder. You don't have to type them in a box or anything like that, but just as we work through, let's think about those things. Feeling good about this, Jen? I can't hear you. You can just do a thumbs up if you want. Okay. All right. So it is called the role of life experiences in shaping brain development. And as we move forward in a perfect world, I don't think it's moving forward, Jen. You've probably heard of the Building Strong Brains Tennessee work if you work with children or adolescents or their families in any shape, form, or fashion. And so if you haven't, there we go. If you haven't heard of it before, we're so excited you're here. If you've heard of it before, if you are a trained trainer on this stuff, if you feel like you could talk about it, then we're glad you're here too. And we hope you talk about it everywhere you go, because there's no one really that can't benefit from a better understanding of this work. So we'll go ahead and get moving, I think. And just so you know, we practiced this earlier and all was well and good with the world, which may not be the case at this exact moment.
All right, Melissa, hold on one second. Okay. Of course, we're having a little bit of trouble. I'm going to give it back to you. And then if we keep having trouble, you can just tell me to click forward.
Okay, perfect.
Hold on one second.
You probably know we've done this so much together.
Bear with me. All right. Maybe
okay.
Third time's a charm.
All right. All right. Perfect. We think. I don't think it's moving, Jen.
All right, girl. Just tell me to advance. Let's
do it. Let's do it. So the main thing we want you to know as we kick off this conversation is that the Building Strong Brains Tennessee, you kind of heard Richard give a better explanation, but it really is a public-private partnership that has a public steering group and a private sector steering group. It is supported by foundations, by in-kind resources, and our state government dollars. And so the key to this partnership is that public-private work, public-private partnerships are critical for shifting the culture in our state. So what this shows us, and it shows other states and federal people, is that it's a collective responsibility for all of us, and the outcomes that we see are ones that benefit everyone in our state. And this is the mission for Building Strong Brains Tennessee, is to really work to change the culture of Tennessee so that our state's overarching policies, philosophy, programs, and practices for children, youth, and young adults really use the latest brain science in order to prevent and mitigate the impact of the adverse childhood experiences, or what we abbreviate as ACEs, if you're not familiar with that. What we also know, and you can flip it, Jen, is that, I just kind of hit all that too. Let's flip it one more time. Is that it really takes an overarching message from science. And it is a clear message that how children develop early in life matters later in life for them and for the rest of us. Because as you see in this graphic, healthy child development, it's a kind of a picture of a almost like the front of an old Gothic building with columns, if you're on the phone and can't see that. But what we know is that the foundation of healthy child development is things like educational achievement, economic productivity, healthy child development is the foundation for these outcomes of educational achievement, economic productivity, becoming responsible citizens, and having better health throughout the life cycle. Those things build off of the sturdy foundation of healthy child development. And when you start building those 4 pillars up off of that sturdy foundation, what you're building is not only strong and healthy children, you're building successful parents and successful community members for the next generation of children. And when we start moving into a generational cycle like that with healthier child development and better outcomes, then what we know is we're building communities to be stronger and we're building a more healthy economy. And that's what you see at the top of that building. That's why it's so important to start early, because it's not just about my opinion or Jen's opinion or the state of Tennessee's opinion. It comes from multiple disciplines: neuroscience, molecular biology, genetics, behavioral and social science, and even from the economic sector, economic analysis of human capital and how human capital development affects. So what we know is that early development really matters, and children will be more successful later in life, in school and as adults, when we can provide the strongest early foundation possible. So you can go, Jen. And really what we're going to look at this through, kind of the lens with which we're going to look at this, is around these 4 concepts, core concepts of development. These came from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, which is a phenomenal resource. If you have not found that one yet, block off some time in your calendar, because you're just going to click around through there and see so much valuable work. The Harvard Center for the Developing Child. They came up with these 4 concepts that center around brain architecture, serve and return, toxic stress, and resilience. And we're going to dive deeper into those as we go forward, so I'm not going to make you read all those right at this moment. I think the next thing we have, Jen, is our brain architecture video. So. Jen, I don't think it's playing. We do want you to know we practiced all of this earlier. It's the proverbial WebEx meeting conversation. And we'd love to be able to show you these because it really does help bring to life what we're going to talk about. So we will get some opinion from Jen here in about 32 seconds.
I'm going to try one more time. Hold on one second.
Okay.
I think I was kicked off the H drive, and so let's just move forward right now, and I'll try to reconnect and download them directly to my desktop. I'm sorry, guys.
No, all is well. We'll just jump right in the brain architecture piece. So what we know is that brains are built over time. Babies don't just come out with the most well-developed cognitive skills, but that building starts in the earliest years of life, even prenatally. And so what we've learned and are understanding more and more every day is that simple skills come first, and they're followed by more complex skills as you build on top of the skills already learned. Jen, I don't know if you can see the PowerPoint, but I don't think that we can see. Is that what's missing? I can't hear you, friend.
I'm sorry. Let me try again.
That's okay. I mean, I can talk for days. They may get a little bored without something.
Yeah. Hold on one.
Yeah. So while she's figuring that out, I'll go ahead and keep talking to us. But brains are built over time. That building starts in the earliest years of life, and simple skills come first. And then as we build those simple skills, the more complex skills come later. And so that's the key, is understanding that dynamic, because what we know is that our cognitive, our emotional, and our social capabilities are inextricably intertwined, which means you cannot undo them from each other. So when you hear someone talking about, well, we're only going to do academic learning or cognitive learning in school, that's not really possible, because what we're learning and understanding and know through the data more and more is that all of those things come together, much like a rope, like a intertwined rope that is together so tightly and can hold so much strain. Those three things, cognitive, emotional, social capabilities, come together to create strong academic and health outcomes, including emotional well-being and social competence, because those two really provide an excellent and strong foundation for the academic or cognitive piece. So when we try to parse things out and separate things out, it's not going to go well, because that's just not how it works. For those of us who work with kids, if we've worked in schools or community centers or churches with youth groups, you know that what happens outside of those walls comes into where you are. And so we have to continue to support the full development as well, because learning is a process, and the brain weaves all these things together to create a really strong skills rope that will help the foundation. So it's really important as we support and develop those emerging cognitive abilities, that they become the bricks and mortar that form that foundation of healthy child development and human development. Because what we know is with a strong foundation, we're going to have a lot better odds for more positive outcomes later in life. But with weaker foundations that don't have as much support, then it increases the odds for potential later life difficulties. So we'll go to the next one. So when you're thinking about building a strong foundation, we want you to think about building a house. Thinking about a house, if you build a home, what is the first thing that you do? This is where if I was in front of you, you would start talking to me, and that's wonderful. But since I'm not in front of you, I will just go ahead and share, really, when you build a house, the first thing you got to do is lay the foundation, right? If any of you have ever built a home or purchased a home and gone through inspection, and someone has come back and said, hey, we've got some foundation issues, your first response most likely is going to be like, peace out, don't want to deal with that. Because what you know is that when you start with foundation issues, you may try to address those, but those are going to have to be addressed throughout the lifetime of your ownership of that house. So when we think about brains, we really want to think about the strong foundation, because when we have healthier foundations early in life, just like when you're building a house, then we have better future brain development. If the foundation is laid poorly, we may start to see symptoms that show those cracks, things like addiction, mental health problems, physical disease, trouble in school, and then those just continue to move forward as they go through life if they're not addressed. So when you think about building a home and you're working on that strong foundation, then the other thing you know is that it's built in a particular and specific sequence. we don't start putting in the electrical work before we've even put up the frame, right? There's an order to which it's done. And it takes a lot of different people with a lot of different skills to build that house, a framer, an electrician, a plumber, a roofer. All of those people and more come together. So when we think about construction of a child's brain, we really depend on high quality relationships with all sorts of folks, early childhood providers, high quality early childhood providers, medical professionals, school professionals, faith persons, community center workers, bus drivers, the mailman. Amazon just delivered a package to my house. And so all those people that we interact with, those are folks who build healthy brains, including us. We're those people too. And so we want you to understand that that strong foundation comes from all of us. That's why this matters for all of us. And we want to increase the likelihood of more positive outcomes and decrease the likelihood that a weaker early foundation would happen. And because we know that getting things right the first time is a whole lot easier than trying to fix things later in life. So Jen, we can pop to the next slide. So this slide, I love this slide because really, if you think about it, when kids go, most kids, they go all out 90 miles an hour and you're like, I am tired, you are going. But then when they crash, they crash. Most of them, they just need a lot of sleep, they need a lot of rest, and they'll go, 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 go. But when they're out for most children. And so the key is that in those first few years of life, what you see here is a newborn on the left, at 6 months in the middle, and then on the right is 2 years. And those are neural connections. So those are the activity in our brain that starts working together and coming together to create connections to help our brain form its patterns and its development. And you can see that at newborn, there's some activity going on. And then by the time they're 6 months old, it is definitely increased, right? Because a child is really born ready to learn, and that their experiences and their environment all influences how that neural connectivity happens. And so we have heard and learned, the Harvard Center for the Developing Child studies this, that there is more than 1 million new neural connections every second through the first few years of life. That is crazy. No wonder those kids have to sleep. There is a lot going on up there, right? And so there's, by the time we're 2, excuse me, there's a whole lot happening. It is busy. And so by the time kids are about 3, we see that 85% of their brain volume, like just pure size, not their smarts or their understanding, just their size, by the time they're 3, 85% of brain volume is in place. And so that is key because that's telling you how much activity is going on up there. So as they get to 2, 3 years old, then they have to start a process that scientifically is called pruning. So what's happening is there's a lot of things happening, and they need to start identifying which connections are the most important, for lack of better words, because those connections that happen more often or are repetitive is what the developing brain is going to put emphasis on. Those are the connections that the developing brain says, hey, we need these more often. So we're going to further secure those connections so that that information can travel faster and more efficiently. And so then the connections that aren't used as much are the ones that get pruned away or less secure because they're not used as much. And so what the brain is realizing is, hey, we need this connection more like 4 or 5 times a day, but we don't need this connection maybe once a week. So it prunes away the ones that are less used. It's almost like that use it or lose it type philosophy. But the tricky part of this is that it can be a double-edged sword, because what we hope and trust is happening in a lot of ways is that the more secure connections, the one that say, hey, when a baby's hungry, they cry and somebody comes and feeds, a caregiver comes and feeds the baby. Or when the baby doesn't feel good, they cry and a caregiver says, you've got something going on, and they start to work at what's going on with that baby or that child. Unfortunate, and those are when the secure connections are very healthy and we're working on very strong foundations. The unfortunate part is that sometimes the young developing brain, the young child's developing brain incorporates experiences that may be abusive or profoundly neglectful. And these alter their brain processes because the connections that become more secure are the ones that may not trust adults as much to meet needs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the attachment cycle later in the slide deck. But these influences, as you can see here, they begin even prenatally. That's why it's so important for us to help educate and others to understand. Will you flip this slide, Jen? So this graph really is one of my favorites because it gives, I'm a visual learner, and so this stuff is pretty awesome for me, but it provides information on how different sets of skills develop at different times in the brain and how more complex skills really build on each other, and they build on the basic skills that came before. Circuits build on circuits, skills produce skills. So that's important for us when we start thinking about how this works. So if you look at this, kind of to the left of the green box as you're looking at it is the prenatal period. So the prenatal period in the first year of life, or the first couple of years of life, are really more, the first year of life is really more extended. So that's where you see the positive 1 to 11, and then the 1 year and the 2 year mark. So they extend this out a little bit more because what we want you to see here is there's very rapid proliferation of neural connections. That just means that stuff is growing quickly. It is happening fast. Remember that 1 million per second that we talked about in the last slide? That's the natural process, is that it's going to build, and then it's going to start to prune away the stuff that isn't used because it helps our brains become more efficient by eliminating things that we don't use as much. So when we start to think about self-regulation, which is one of the higher level cognitive skills that you see here, our ability to control our behavior and emotions and responses is really one of the last skills that develops. So we start building the set of skills way early before we even get to the self-regulation piece. It begins prenatally and in infancy and really continues through our late teens and mid-20s. So that kind of helps us understand why children, youth, and young adults continue to need adults to model and support them in this work. And it's critical when we think about where we put public investment, public support, because the brain is doing really important building in those early, very early years, all the way through even before school starts. And so it's critical for us to start building these circuits and continue to support those at every stage so that when we can't even get to the higher cognitive functioning skills and support those as best possible. All right, Jen, I think we're up to serve and return. And do you want to try the video?
I sure do, y'all. I'm going to try a workaround. Again, I'm very, very sorry we're having these technical issues. It's the age we're living in right now, so bear with me.
If you can hear me, I can go ahead and tell a little bit about serve and return. Can you still hear me, Jen?
Yeah, I sure can. Go ahead and do that. I think
Okay,
it's working. Okay.
Let's do it. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, Jen, I like it.
Okay.
Perfect. So the key is we're talking about this brain architecture, about building strong foundations. We know that genes and experiences shape the developing brain. It is what helps build brain architecture, and it's critical to have these serve and return relationships. And so you may think, what are you talking about? Like serve and return, that sounds weird. That sounds like sports. Well, yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. Things like tennis or volleyball, where it's passed back and forth. But the key to this one is that the infant or the child is the one who serves to the caregiver or the adult. So they may babble or gesture or cry. And when we respond to that, that's a return. And so they're literally like reaching out for us in a literal sense and a metaphorical sense. Like if you have seen that, I think it's Geico, the insurance company commercial, where that dad is walking through the house and he's got two kids, like one attached to each leg. That's literally serve and return. A lot of videos have been coming up lately in our quarantine world that have kept us all maybe more hopeful, more positive around our circumstances, that just show how creative folks are being with their children, how much they're able to incorporate this serve and return through words, through hugs, through play, all those sorts of things. And so, Jen, we can scoot to the next one. So this is what I was mentioning earlier, is if we're serving in return, what does that really look like? So how do babies communicate, right? How do they even tell us? How do they serve to us? Well, babies cry. It's what they do, right? And so when a caregiver hears a baby cry, that caregiver says, ooh, that's a poopy cry, or that's a hungry cry, or however that may work. And so they really are hearing and knowing that child so that they understand, because healthy attachment starts prenatally. It starts in the womb. Hey, Jen, you might not be muted, just FYI. But healthy attachment starts in the womb, and when a mom-to-be takes care of herself physically, when her partner helps take care of both of them, when they have stable living and financial conditions, and they avoid chronic stress situations. And so that helps the baby's brain develop prenatally. And so the baby, was born into the world, and it's almost like being alien to this world. They don't know what is safe. They don't know what is not safe. They haven't acquired language. They have very minimal ability to communicate. They come from an environment where they're always warm, always fed, constantly taken care of. They can hear mom's heartbeat back and forth, and then they enter this world where they might be cold and hungry and just unknown. And so that is when the baby cries and needs something. So the baby has a need, and we think about it. They cry. That need is met. Oh, that's a hungry cry. You're ready for your next meal. And so that baby starts to learn trust, because they learn that when they have a need, then the caregiver is going to take care of that need. And then the repetitive conversation that comes, like, oh, you're hungry, or oh, you need some milk, then the baby starts to learn words for what that delicious stuff is that the caregiver provides, right? So that is key. Language is happening, trust is developing. There's so much going on. And then when the baby has another need, they cry, the need is met, and then they develop more trust. So it's just this cycle that happens repetitively throughout a day, and then throughout a month, and then throughout a year. And then that child becomes better at communicating their needs. Unfortunately, and we can slip to the next one, Jen, unfortunately, there is an insecure attachment or trauma cycle where that attachment piece is unavailable to the infant, and that may have long-lasting effects. That infant does the same thing. They have a need, they're hungry, and they cry or express that in another manner, but they don't receive a response from the caregiver. The child doesn't become calm. They don't know how to regulate themselves. And when this happens repeatedly over the course of a day or a month or several years, then that child attempts to make the best decision they can through whatever type of self-regulation they can. but they don't have the skill set to do self-regulation, because remember, that's way on down the skill set road, and we've got to meet the basic needs first. So when there is even inconsistent attachment, so let's say a caregiver is struggling with something and they are not responding every single time, that can still have an effect. So even inconsistent attachment by an adult caregiver may create anxiety for the child because they don't know whether or not their needs are going to be met. So when they're in this intermittent cycle of being unsure if their needs were going to be met, then they may have a difficulty responding appropriately as they get older when an adult does try to intervene. When some random, trusting, supportive adult tries to intervene in this child's life, they don't know that about that adult. They don't have this same experience. Their brain wiring has literally been developed around inconsistent and intermittent attachment. And so they're unable to build to those higher level skills. So even though they may not remember all of those, the brain and the body remember the traumatic interactions. And so that's why it's important that, and we've really hopefully shifted away from the conversation, oh, that happened so young, they'll never remember it, because the body remembers whether or not the mind does. Jen, I think we're up for that still face experiment video.
Bear with me 1 second.
Sure thing. So we're going to show you a video that really is a great just visual around this serve and return piece, but there's a few things we'll talk about when we're done with that video. There we go. I love that video. And so what I want you to think about is what were your like physical reactions to that video? If you've not ever seen it, I've seen it a gazillion times and I still have like physical reactions. Like if you watch me watch that video, my face mimics the child. Like I'm smiling when the child's smiling. I'm upset when she's upset. And so that's a great example about like thinking through what did you notice? And it demonstrates to us how much small children really depend on that serve and return, because you saw when that mom was great at just being still face. And so when you saw when that mom turned away and then turned back and had no reaction to the child whatsoever, the child used everything that had worked before to try and get the mom to interact, and then increasingly escalated, because that's the key. The mom wasn't yelling at the child. She did not leave. She was not physically threatening to the child. She simply did not respond. She did not return the serve. Children are hardwired for this interaction, and when they don't get it, they get distressed. And that may not be news to any of us that have interacted with children, but it's helpful to think about in this sense, because the key here is that the child in that video obviously had a healthy relationship with mom, right? A healthy attachment. This is behavior typical. The tricky part is when you've got a baby who doesn't have that healthy attachment, they aren't getting that consistent interaction. That's when we start to see potential long-term effects come into play. All right, so as we think about that, we also want to think about what we say as intergenerational transmission, which means exactly what it sounds like, passing it down from one generation to the other. And we can see how adversity, how trauma can move from one generation to the other, because when a person experiences early adversity, we know that it leads to a stress response system that doesn't respond correctly. It's dysregulated. It's not a healthy stress response system. So when they move into this, growing older and their stress response is dysregulated, then what happens next is they start to regulate themselves with things that could be tricky, like substance use, or they have mental health concerns. They become higher at risk for addiction and severe mental health problems because they're trying to regulate with things that really don't work terribly well or at all. So then if they move into a place where they struggle with substances, have severe untreated mental health issues, and they become parents, then that could impair their ability to respond to infants, because they don't know what to do when their infants start crying. They're not able to use the experiences they had potentially to form responses. So then at the bottom, I'm not sure if you can see that bottom blue block, that's a tongue twister down there, but at the bottom, then they become more stressed as parents. They feel like they don't know how to parent. So it just increases their stress load even more. So then they go back to those behaviors that they've used before to help chill them out or help them forget. And then that may mean that they turn away from their infant. They are inconsistent or intermittent in their response, which can lead to parental neglect and or abuse of that child, which creates a new child with early adversity. And so you can see how this generational piece, and what I experienced when I work with persons with higher numbers of ACEs is kind of the phenomenon of, it was good enough for my mama, it'll be good enough for me, where they had such early adversity, their brain's literally wired around it, and so they don't know how to even dream. Their brain circuitry doesn't even allow them to see anything differently. Will you move to the next one, Jen? So that serve and return interactions that happen to children when they naturally reach out for us, when they're babbling, when they're pulling on our earrings while they're holding them, or our longer hair, that is key. That back and forth is key to really building brains, building their skills, and it just continues back and forth. When little Susie comes home from the preschool and tells mom or dad or caregiver about what they did all day in preschool. It's just that back and forth, much like tennis or volleyball, and we respond in kind to the children. And it works best when it's a trusting relationship between the child and the adult, because then they understand each other better. You're learning each other. It's how we learn our friends, our families, our partners. And they're mutually rewarding interactions, and it's essential to develop brains. And we also know that most of these important relationships happen or begin in family units. But we also know that isn't always the case. There are other adults who play important roles, including grandparents, early care providers, educators. All of those folks continue to play important roles. Will you forward, Jen? So this is a study that's really fascinating, and this is just a simple visual for it, but we'll talk you through it. So you see three colors. I call them green, red, and purple. Some people see that top line as blue, but the top line, purplish blue color. So what you see here on the bottom, x-axis is age in months. So it starts at 12 months and we go all the way to 26 months. And then on the y-axis, the vocabulary size, how many words do kids from 12 to 26 months have in their vocabulary? The markers are 200 words, 400, 600, or 800 words. And so when you look at that blue-purple line, it's representing, as you can tell by the key down at the bottom, a mother who had a high level of speech with that child. So we just looked at moms and their speech with the children. And I think this was back in the early 90s that this was published. So it's been a hot minute, but it's a great representation even back then to remind us of this serve and return piece. So when you think about that purplish line, think that that's a mom who's probably like a hairstylist. She talks all day. My hairstylist and I have been together for a long time. She's walked with me through some of the best and some of the hardest times that I've had. So we chit-chat back and forth the whole time. She's talkative. She's always asking about my life. You know, it's just part of what they do. And so then they go pick the baby up from daycare, maybe, the child, and they get in the car, and Mama is just steadily chit-chatting with this child. Well, honey, let me tell you what I saw today. Like just steadily talking to this child. That could be a high level of speech. If we go down to the bottom line, the green line, let's think that maybe that mother is a dental hygienist. And we know that folks who work in dental offices probably don't get a lot of interactive speech because their clients, their patients, can't talk. And so they may not talk as much. So when that mom goes and picks up her child, she's just not in the talking place. So she doesn't talk as much to her child. So that's kind of where I want you to think, because as we look from 12 months, most kids started out with just a few words in their vocabulary, even from the start of life and how their experiences shaped. But as they grew up to 26 months, you can see that the level of a mother's speech really influenced how many words were in their vocabulary at 26 months. So a kid with a high level of mom speech went all the way up to almost 800 words in their vocabulary, while a child who had a mother with a low level of speech, theirs hovered around 200 words. That's a huge difference when you think about the progress and the building of that brain. So it's key to think through, like, not our default thought sometime of, oh, well, the green line mom is neglecting her child. It may literally just be circumstance. What if green line mom is a dental hygienist in the day and she works as a pharmacy tech in the evening so that she can make the best life possible for her child? She literally doesn't see her child in many waking hours. That could be a hindrance. So we don't want to just default to, oh, that's a bad mom. We want to think about circumstances and how do we better support parents to be as interactive and supportive as we can with their children. All right, Jen, there we go. So this graph is also awesome because it talks about what we refer to as plasticity, or the ability that our brain can reorganize and adapt, and how high that is in the first years of life, and we lose that capability as we get older. I always like to say, if I want to learn Spanish now, or even any second language now, because I only have one, unfortunately, it's going to take a lot more effort for me, and Rosetta Stone and I are going to get really close for me to be able to do Spanish well, as opposed to when I'm younger. If I'm exposed to that and it's there from birth, then my brain is going to be wired around a multiple language learning type thing. So it's easier and it's more effective for us to get brain development right at the beginning than it is for us to fix them later in life. So what you see is as the brain matures, it is more specialized to those complex functions, and it's less capable of reorganizing because we're in more complex skill sets. So when we lose that plasticity or that ability to change across the years, then it also requires more effort for us to do that changing. And we do get, as you see in this little green area, a bump in adolescence, like during puberty and adolescence. We get a little window where they get a little higher return for their investment in brain changing or plasticity. And so we never want to discount anyone because the brain can always be changed. It's just the amount of effort versus the ability is inverses as we go through life, if that's the right way to say that. When we think about adolescent brain, if we are thinking about remodeling the brains, I've always done adolescent and family therapy, and a lot of people in my profession would come up and say, I don't know how you work with teenagers. And my response is 99% of the time, I don't know how you work with adults, so there's that. And I'm an adult, and I wouldn't want to work with me either. But the key is, especially with adolescents, we have an opportunity to really shift if they've had a rough go of it to this point. And it's really an opportune time to help them build resilience, because we know that, as you see here, the adolescent, well, you don't see this here, but we know that the adolescent brain overproduces brain cells and connections between them. And so when you start moving into more complex skills that happen in our prefrontal cortex, which is just right behind our forehead, and it's the piece that really works on planning, memory, and organization. It helps us work on our mood, helps us modulate our mood. And these all contribute to what is known as executive functioning or air traffic control system. So it's the second period of really rapid growth. We also know that there's that use it or lose it piece. It's going to continue to prune away those connections that aren't used as much. And then the different sides of our brains, especially in adolescence, starts integrating with each other. Information starts moving back and forth. And that's key, because that helps us not just live in like an emotional response side of our brain. So that's the important piece, is to really know that while early childhood development is huge, we can continue to make a difference throughout the lifespan, especially in adolescence. So you're probably wondering, like, well, if brain architecture is so key, building a strong foundation, and serve and return is what helps us build a strong foundation, then there's got to be something that disrupts it, and you would be correct in your assumption. So we're going to see a little video about toxic stress. So when we think about like toxic stress, we may be giving you new language that you've just maybe heard stress or stressful situations or things like that. We're going to give you a little bit broader definition of stress, and specifically around toxic stress, because what that is stress that is so high, it actually becomes toxic to our body systems. Because when we get stressed, extremely stressed for potentially longer periods of time, what we know is that our heart rate increases, our blood pressure increases, our respirations, the rate that we breathe at, our blood sugar increases, our hormone release goes up. And so we kind of move into this fight or flight response. So when our stress response system is activated ongoing in an early child, an infant, young child, early child, and that is an ongoing thing, that can really have a negative effect on their continued development. So what we see here is the 3 levels of stress that we want to talk to you about. And I'll do my best. I usually flip back and forth between these next 2, but I'm going to talk through this one and we'll talk through the next one. So I just want to be able to call you back to this one when we get to the next slide. So hang with me. But we want to think about positive stress. So there are such things as positive stressors, right? Not all stress is toxic to children, and some stress helps them prepare for life as they go forward, right? So maybe taking your child to their first day of preschool or their first day of kindergarten, and they're just maybe having a little bit harder time. You've been able to be at home with them, whatever the case, and you're stressed out, but you're trying to put on a happy face. Like, it's a positive stress or short stressful events like the first day of school type things, but then you get the child to school, you hand them off to the teacher's like, I got you. I'll text you, go on the websites, in an hour. And sure enough, you get a text, you go on the video, and little Billy Bob, he's just having a big time. He is doing his thing, meeting new people, and he's not a tear in sight. And so that is positive stress. He was stressed and didn't know how to handle it potentially. Same thing with getting a shot. You're using all the ammunition in your bag to kind of, here, I'll give you a sucker, we'll go get ice cream, we'll go get a toy, if they have to go get their immunizations. And they're freaking out, maybe crying, you get to the doctor's office, tears everywhere, and as soon as that shot is done, what is that child's first question? Can we go get ice cream now? Like, that's a positive stressor because it helps them understand that some things are going to be able to be worked through. If we move into the next category of tolerable stress, then we look at those things that are really tragic and unavoidable, and it's things that none of us want to experience, but we're going to because we live in this life. And so things like the death in a family, or maybe a significant illness in the family, an injury, something like that. Those are tragic, unavoidable events that really aren't good for us. But because they're supportive, caring adults in that child's life, they buffer that stress response system. It helps keep that stressor from doing lifelong damage to that child's developing brain. They're able to model the behavior of how do we even walk through this. Then we think about toxic stress. This is the biggest difference. The thing I want you to take home from this is ongoing, repeated exposure to abuse or neglect, and it disrupts brain development or household dysfunction. It is bad. When it is toxic stress, there is no supportive adult for that child to help buffer their stress response. Stress chemicals will be released because this child is living in an ongoing state of toxic stress, and that release of hormones, your body's having to deal with that, so everything else stops, including brain development, and it harms the continued development of the brain. And so that creates more vulnerability to lifelong issues, physical and mental health issues, including things like addiction and disease. So that's when we want you to think about positive stress versus tolerable stress versus toxic stress. And then if we flip to the next slide, this is where it's a good visual for us, because we talk about that stress response system and the responsive relationships that we need with children that are essential, because the absence of that interactive relationship, that supportive relationship, is really a threat to their well-being. And or if it's unreliable or inconsistent, then that really could disrupt the brain architecture and the development of that sturdy foundation. And learning how to cope with adversity is a key part of healthy childhood development, right? When we're threatened, our bodies prepare us to respond by telling us your heart's beating faster, you're breathing faster, your blood pressure is going up. And so we start to notice that. We all have reactions like that. So when you look at the stress response system, stress hormones, things like cortisol that you've probably heard a lot about. So in positive stress, you see that that stress hormone shoots up, but then as soon as that stressor is over, it goes back down almost to normal, and then it works its way back toward baseline. So it's a brief increase in heart rate, in respiration rate, blood pressure, things like that. When we get to tolerable stress, those stress hormones shoot up, and as that event passes, they are with a supporting, caring adult, and they are watching that adult walk through that and being supported by that adult. And so while it may not shoot back down to baseline immediately, that stress hormone level will start to work its way back toward more normal ranges. And that's really key, because what keeps stressors tolerable is the presence of a safe, stable, and nurturing caregiver who buffers that experience. The tricky part, well, this isn't the tricky part. The key is that when children know there's an adult there to buffer for them, their resiliency is going to be way higher because they know that support is there. The tricky part is when exposure to that stress is toxic, when it's ongoing and unrelenting, then that stress hormone level shoots up, and as you see on the right in this third diagram, it stays high. It's almost like the alarm clock that goes off. If you think about that really loud alarm clock with the metal bells on top and a metal clanger in the middle, and that son of a gun could wake up your whole row of houses if it wanted to, that's the alarm clock that goes off during toxic stress, and it just stays going off. And so they live in this increased hormone release system, which is going to require the body to deal with those increased toxic hormones, and everything else just stops. It creates a disruption in brain development. And so that's the key, is really the toxic stress creates the cracks in the strong foundation. Know that toxic stress is prolonged, ongoing exposure to adversity like physical or emotional abuse, chronic neglect, a caregiver with a substance abuse or mental health concern, untreated, exposure to violence in the home, family economic hardship without the adequate support of a caring adult. And so when your body starts to have all these responses and it can't step back from it, that's when we start to see the physical piece come into play. I always like to ask people to think about, how does your body physically respond to stressors? I know that when I get really stressed and I need to sit down and think with myself for a minute, I start to scratch the top of my legs. It's the weirdest thing, I get it, but just go with me. That's what I do. Some people get upset stomachs, some people get headaches, whatever the case may be. I know when I'm sitting at my desk or at my house and I start to scratch the top of my legs that I need to take some inventory of what's going on. We all have physical responses to stressors in our life. So as you think about who you're a stable, nurturing relationship for, also think about how you respond to stress and how you are supported through the stressors even as an adult. All right, Jen. So this is a really great graphic. It's 3 different studies, children ages 2 to 5 per 1,000 children. These are some of the results that we saw. So there's the green children are representative of a study that looked at maltreatment, and maltreatment included things like neglect, physical abuse, sexual assault, psychological abuse, parental custodial interference. It did not include things like spanking or corporal punishment, but it looked at all the things that I like to think of as what I think of as abuse. It's kind of the outward thing. So when you look at children ages 2 to 5 per 1,000 children in this study, 75 of them experienced maltreatment. And so those things that we talked about were included in this study. They don't include some of the biggest conditions that lead to neglect. So in the second study, when you think about postpartum depression and how that may inadvertently lead to significant neglect of a child, 130 children out of every 1,000 in this study were living in a household with a mom with postpartum depression. And so that's one of the key markers for neglect. And then if you move further to the right, the children with the red in the red color, 136 out of every 1,000 of those children, ages 2 to 5, were living in a home with a parent with untreated parental substance abuse or ongoing parental substance abuse. And so while we think of maybe the green children on the left as maltreatment and what we typically categorize, what we want you to understand is that neglect is equally as neurotoxic to the brain as what we historically have filed under maltreatment. And more of our children are reflected in homes that have conditions that could lead to neglect. And so our goal is to really also help build capabilities of adult caregivers to strengthen their relationships and their essential interactions to help build their children's brain, help build better behaviors and lifelong outcomes. Because when we don't have that serve and return interaction, it can be the result of a ton of factors, including things like maltreatment and postpartum depression and parental substance abuse. Could we flip on, Jen? This is one of my favorite slides, and it's really, we like to think of it as a healthy brain versus a neglected brain, because what you see, it's a PET scan, and so as we are all learning, toxic stress in children has devastating effects, and the increased levels of stress chemicals can have physical consequences for our brain. And so some of us are old enough to remember, like back in the 90s, there was a real conversation and need over in Eastern Europe, specifically in places like Romania, because their orphanages had really harsh and overcrowded conditions. They didn't have enough staff, and abuse and neglect were really a daily event in those orphanages. So much so that when babies came in, they even propped their bottles on pillows or blankets to feed, and they almost fed themselves. So these children were significantly lacking in that serve and return interaction. So what you see here is a PET scan, which measures activity in the brain, and you want to see more vibrant colors in the brain. That means there's more activity. I am never going to pretend to be a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, and so we're not going to get into the weeds of this. We're just going to talk about kind of what we see on the surface of this picture. And so on the left, you see a typically developing 3-year-old child compared to the one on the right of a child that was in one of these Romanian orphanages. Also a 3-year-old child that went into the orphanage shortly after birth. And so really the big picture we want you to see here is the activity in the temporal lobes and how vibrant you see those colors on the left versus the absence of color on the right. Lots of reds and yellows and greens, which shows high circuit interactions, high activity, whereas the one on the right really shows minimal color at all. So when we think about that child on the right, and he's 3 or she is 3, and the child on the left is also 3, a lot of people are like, well, how can we get this Romanian child up to normal levels? We can get that child closer and closer, but what we know is it's going to take more resources, more money, and more frequent interventions over a longer period of time to repair the damage that has been done, as opposed to building strength from the beginning, building that strong foundation from the beginning. So I hope that makes sense and provides you just a little bit of physical or visual aid as we think about really how those increased chemical responses can impair development. We flip on, there we go. So you won't be tested on this slide, but we really want to talk about why the toxic stress and the release of all those hormones and chemicals is such a big deal. As you know, our brain is a really complex organ, and so much influences how it is developed. There's a system in there called a limbic system, and it's kind of in the inner brain beneath the cortex. So as you look at this picture, it's kind of that different color in the middle. sits kind of in the middle. It's a collection of really small structures that are involved in our emotional and our stress response systems, as well as our reward-seeking behaviors. And so the limbic system is really primarily associated with our instinctive behaviors, like what we kind of do just off the cuff, so to speak. So as we look at the pieces, the first thing you're going to look at is that amygdala, which is that almond-shaped piece that you see there in that lower midsection of the brain. And it's like that alarm clock. When we encounter stressors, the amygdala has a responsibility to interpret, that's an excellent word, interpret and evaluate, that was a good combination, interpret and evaluate what is coming in, the images, the sounds, and if there is danger, it sends out the alarm. It is that alarm clock that goes off that everybody can hear up and down the street. And so when it goes off, the rest of the body starts, or the rest of the limbic system, and then moves into the rest of our body, starts saying, okay, what do we have to do? What do we have to do? So when the amygdala identifies danger and it triggers our stress response system, the hippocampus, which you see here also very close, assigns a memory and what we call spatial learning. So it assigns kind of memory and mood and the events of what's happening right then. That's why if you work with a child who has high adversity, when you work with a child that has high adversity, then you might walk by that child and you've never met him before or her, and she or he is working with a different professional or whatever, and they see you and they start cussing you out. And you're like, I don't even know you. But there's something that triggered that memory from some adverse event. Maybe it's the brown curly hair. Maybe it's a tall white woman. Something was assigned to that memory when that adversity happened. And so that's why we encounter that sometimes. Also, what happens is there's a hypothalamus in there, and it kind of acts as the control center, and it regulates the release of the stress hormones. And so those things all work together, and the limbic system functions to provide foundation for the continued learning and development of kids and as we grow older. So you can imagine that as those stress response systems come into play, the limbic system is hoping to be well developed and have a strong foundation, because then you're not going to be as responsive or knee-jerk or however you might want to say that in an unhealthy manner. But when it's disrupted by toxic stress, then the brain can't continue to perform important neural connections that move into higher level skills. So it stays in almost like that survival, fight, or flight mode, or freeze. And so that is when the alarm is just constantly going off. And in some of the kids that I've worked with, it has gone off so long that they wouldn't even know that it's an alarm. It's just how they function. And so the cumulative effect of that toxic stress can be really damaging to the developing brain. So Jen, if you'd flip it. So what we're learning as we think about how toxic stress affects us is we're learning a ton more about gene expression, or kind of the study of gene expression is called epigenetics. If you're a cool kid out there and you want to go study higher education type things, go into epigenetics. It's so much fun and it's so just popping right now. But epigenetics is the study of changes in gene expressions without the genes changing themselves. This epigenome is really like a memory that our genes have of the environments that we live in. So let's just think of it like genetic memory. So genes can remember things from outside our bodies that affect how things inside our bodies work. So how our bodies heal, or how children's bodies develop, and how our bodies deal with stress. The idea is that if something can affect the inside of our bodies, our genes can remember that. And so those genetic memories alter how our genes run inside our bodies and how it runs our bodies working. Just like our memories can affect the decisions that we make. So we can make new memories by going out and running a marathon tomorrow, just like our genes can make new memories by how the parts inside our bodies work. And that can affect how our organs function and develop. Experiences can change how genes express themselves, especially as that's developing and building throughout childhood, because the kids will live with these memories for the rest of their lives, whether they can actually recall it verbally or if it's just how their the genes respond. And so one of the coolest studies that's been out around this is it looked at mice. So researchers in Emory University in Atlanta conducted studies with mice to help identify the role of toxic stress and how genes express themselves. And so what they found is that a newborn mouse pup may actually harbor generations worth of information that's been passed down from ancestor to ancestor. And so what they did was they took little baby mice and they took male mice and they taught male mice to fear the smell of cherry blossoms by associating that smell and shocking their feet. So when they smelled the cherry blossom smell, they shocked their feet. 2 weeks later, they bred these mice with female mice, and they had offspring. Those offspring were raised to adulthood with no exposure whatsoever to the cherry blossom smell. So even with no exposure to the cherry blossom smell, when those offspring were first exposed to that scent, they exhibited similar characteristics that their fathers had. They became anxious and fearful. They also found that the offspring were born with more cherry blossom receptors in their nasal cavity, in their noses, and more brain space developed to cherry blossom smelling. So then they're like, okay, that's kind of cool. Let's go out to a second generation. So it would be the grand mice pups of the original foot shock pups. And so they found very similar results. So then these are smart kids down at Emory, and they're like, you know what? Those pups grew up with mama and daddy. Maybe there's some sort of environmental thing going on there. So then they were going to try to control for those social influences, and they artificially inseminated female mama mice way over here who had never even been exposed to the original daddy mice. And when those offspring came out and they were grown up to adulthood, they also found that when they were exposed to that cherry blossom smell, they were more jumpy than when smelling just a neutral odor, even though they had never been exposed to that before. And they also noticed it in their offspring. So what we know is that's in mice. And mice may not always be, directly relatable to humans, but it's where we start with learning more. And so we can't necessarily just extrapolate this out to humans, but what we know is that genes are vulnerable to modification in response to toxic stress environments, to nutritional problems, or other negative things that underscore the importance of needing that healthy early development in those earliest years. And so while we still don't understand all the pieces of epigenetics and how genes change and all that stuff, it's a great start to helping us understand more about why early life experiences are so important to understand and really provide the strongest that we can. Will you flip it forward, Jen? All right, so I am moving a little slow, but we got this. So air traffic control, we talked a little bit about this. Executive functioning is a group of skills that help us to focus on multiple streams of information. It's key when we think about being ready for school, as well as getting people ready for success in health and employment. And so this air traffic control piece really is now being pointed to by science as a set of skills that are foundation to the ability to learn. And so unfortunately, toxic stress does disrupt this, and they have children who experience high toxic stress have less ability to manage their stressors. Will you flip to the next one, Jen? So when we think about air traffic control, we think about like these executive functioning skills. Inhibitory control, or their ability to filter thoughts and impulses to resist temptations and distractions. Working memory, when we can hold and manipulate information in our heads over a short period of time. And then the cognitive flexibility to be able to adjust to demands as they change. Will you flip it, Jen? This slide, it kind of just gives us a very wide snapshot about building air traffic control in the developing brain. So you see some very different age groups here and how those three skills may look in different ages. And so really when we think about inhibitory control at 9 to 16 months, an infant or a toddler is going to begin to maintain focus despite distractions. But by the time they're an adult, we hope they have self-control and have situationally appropriate responses. Will you flip it on through, Jen? All right, so when we think about early life stress and how that impacts lifelong development, this is just a little bit of a broader extrapolation from our earlier slide that shows us that stress can happen anytime over childhood, from prenatal period, all the way into adulthood. But the main things to remember is that when these toxic stressors happen, that they are cumulative over time. They don't happen in isolation. They all are cumulative. If they are all separate or a long period of a stressor, it's cumulative over time, and it makes a difference when they happen. When the brain is in a more sensitive period of development, that is what could be even more toxic to the developing brain. And so that's why you may see that some children respond differently than others to the same stressor. So I think what we're going to show you next is a great little video that really sums up everything we just talked about in the past hour or a little over. And it's about 4 minutes long, and it's awesome. Personal opinion, not that of TCCY. I love the laughter at the end there, but that gives you a very short video that is available. I think I saw a question pop up about would we be able to see the videos because some of you are having a little bit of a hard time hearing them. Those are available in the public domain. I think Jen may help us know a little later how you can access those. The Brain Architecture, Serve and Return, and Toxic Stress are available through the Harvard Center for the Developing Child website. But Jen's smarter than me when it comes to where those live, and so she can help us.
Melissa, when they send out the certificates and slide deck next week, we can include those links in the
good.
email.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jen. All right, so that is kind of where we're going to end on our kind of developing brain piece and those three of those four key components: brain architecture, serve and return, and toxic stress. We'll hit on resilience a little bit later. I want us to jump into now a little bit of the why, or the background of what helped bring this to our attention. So Jen, if you'll flip the slide, there was a study done back in the early 90s to mid 90s, published in the mid to late 90s, around adverse childhood experiences. What two doctors, one at Kaiser Permanente, which is a private health system out in California, and one at the Centers for Disease Control down in Atlanta. And they were researchers and doctors that really wanted to understand the common denominator for many of the health risk behaviors and the preventable diseases that they saw in their practices. They hypothesized that adversity in childhood might be the root cause of these diseases. So they ended up giving surveys out to middle-aged, mostly white, mostly college, at least some college education people that came into the private health clinics out in California. They were well checks. It wasn't like these people were sick, but they were well checks, and they were just asked if they would answer these questions. They did it in two cohorts, ended up having a little over 17,000 responses. So a pretty nice response to their questionnaires. And this is what you see here is the demographics. 75% had at least some college in their background, almost 75% were white, and almost 85% were over the age of 40. So they were middle-aged, white, middle-class, college-educated folks who had insurance, because remember, Kaiser Permanente was a private medical provider. They probably didn't face as many of life's challenges as people who have grown up with poverty or racism in their history. And so when we flip over to the next slide, they asked questions around 10 questions around 10 types of adversity, including 5 types of abuse or neglect as children and 5 types of household dysfunction. So you can see there was physical, emotional, sexual abuse questions, physical and emotional neglect. And then when they looked at household dysfunction, they looked at mental illness, having an incarcerated relative, having a mother that was treated violently, a parent or caregiver who'd struggled with substance abuse or mental illness, and then being the child of divorce. And in every category except incarceration, at least 10% of the population experienced the adversity. And that prevalence was really high when you think about who answered these questions: mostly white, college educated, middle class, insured people. Will you flip that over, Jen? So as you look at their studies, you can see that 64% had at least one ACE, or adverse childhood experience, before the age of 18, and almost a quarter, 22%, had 3 or more ACEs. Then will you flip one more time for me, Jen? What they saw is that as an ACE score increases, so does the risk for health risk behaviors, disease, social problems, and mental health issues. ACEs have been found to have what we call a graded dose response relationship with over 40 negative outcomes to date. What that means is, as the number of ACEs goes up, as the number of ACEs increases, the intensity of the response or the likelihood that they were going to have poorer outcomes also increases. So what you see here are some of the negative outcomes associated with an increasing ACE score. So you can kind of think of it like a cholesterol score for childhood trauma. The ACE study found that the higher someone's ACE score, the more types of adversity that they experienced, then the higher risk they had for chronic disease, mental illness, violence, being a victim of violence, and other consequences as they got older. a few examples were people with an ACE score of 4 or more were twice as likely to be smokers and 7 times more likely to be alcoholics. Having an ACE score of 4 increases the risk of emphysema and chronic bronchitis by nearly 400% and suicide by 1,200%. An ACE score of 6 or more was associated with 3,000% increase in attempted suicide. One of the biggest things that we look at is an ACE score of 4 or more was found to show an increased risk of 5-year shortened lifespan, while an ACE score of 6 or more had a risk of a 20-year shortened lifespan. So Jen, will you skip forward 2 slides? Oh, no, you did it. Good job. So what we want to look at is this is one of the original pyramids that was created by Dr. Robert Anda. He's one of the original researchers, co-investigators, and he developed this to help explain the relationship between ACEs and the rates of disease and disability associated with a higher ACE score. So when children and families don't have public policies and community supports in place to prevent higher ACE scores, then that can lead to a disrupted brain development because they don't have the same resources to get serve and return interactions. Science has shown that higher ACE scores compromise that social, emotional, and cognitive development, and the toxic stress alone compromises the immune system, and it can lead to higher inflammation in the body overall. So when our communities don't have access or ability to provide safe, stable, and nurturing relationships to support brain development and buffer the constant stress, then children and adolescents who have higher ACE scores tend to adopt behaviors to cope with that stress. So when you see like the bottom level of the pyramid, as that pyramid base grows and you have higher ACE scores, then you have a higher risk of having disrupted neurodevelopment. And when that gets disrupted, then you have a higher risk of social, emotional, and cognitive impairment because those levels can't be reached because you're dealing with some of the more base level needs. When you don't know how to healthily or more healthy approach social, emotional, and cognitive needs, then you might adopt more health risk behaviors to deal with it, which could lead to a higher incidence of disease, disability, and social problems, which could lead to an earlier death. And so that toxic stress, that adversity in early childhood really can impact genetic expression across the lifespan. That's what you see with that yellow arrow going up. And then if we don't break that cycle, is that it can be passed on from generation to generation. And that's that whole, it was good enough for my mom, it'll be good enough for me. And so we know that if parents had high ACE scores, and they have children, they have a much higher likelihood of passing on those ACEs to their own children. Communities that have supports in place that provide safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments, those are communities where we can disrupt this pattern. And so that's why it's important to start thinking about 2-generation and 3-generation strategies like home visiting and parent education to help break this cycle of intergenerational trauma. So I think that's where I'm going to take a breather, and we're going to let you guys maybe take a breather, let's say for 4 minutes. It's not a big breather, but at least
doing our workaround where I use my personal computer, so we shall see. Thank you for being patient with us through that. We're going to go ahead and reconvene now that it is 2:13 with the rest of our presentation. And so many of you may be thinking to yourself, those original 10 ACEs that they studied, it seems like there's other types of adversity that a kid might experience that would give them toxic stress. And so in the 20 years that we have been studying this, certainly other researchers have been looking at additional stressors in the literature that lead to poor outcomes. So our friends in Philadelphia really thought about a group of experiences that are common among a more racially and socioeconomically diverse population, like the population that makes up Philadelphia, that is very dissimilar in makeup to that original Kaiser Permanente population. So they, in addition to the conventional ACEs, added some expanded ACEs. Those included witnessing violence, living in unsafe neighborhoods, experiencing racism, living in foster care, and experiencing bullying. So a few interesting things came out of this. The first was that divorce, which was one of the original 10 ACEs, was no longer even relevant for that population, as showing to be statistically significant in terms of poor outcomes. But all of these demonstrated that they were valid, expanded adverse childhood experiences, and they were very commonly experienced by people in Philadelphia. So I think 40% of the population had one of these new, at least one of these new expanded ACEs. So we're going to watch a video really quickly. If I can, I'm going to try. Okay. Let me see if my video's back up. All right, good stuff. So it's fascinating to think, I mean, and it's especially relevant right now for us to be thinking pretty deeply about these other kinds of experiences, these expanded ACEs that cause stress, continual stress, most frequently with communities of color. So what you see in that video is that as young as 4 years old, we're seeing evidence that there's something called implicit bias, right, that's showing up where people are expecting the worst, particularly from kids of color, especially if they're male, right? And we see that show up in the data with disproportionate discipline and disproportionate expulsion of preschoolers who are black and brown, especially if they're boys. So we know that implicit bias is one source of discrimination, and there is subsequent stress as a result of that. To give you a good working definition, the Ohio State University Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity defines implicit bias as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. So what they like to share is that all of us have implicit bias, right? Every single person has implicit bias. The reality, though, is that the implicit bias that is held against black and brown people disproportionately negatively affects them, right? So these biases are both, favorable and unfavorable. But again, we see these poor outcomes related to people of color. So you notice throughout the video that we explain that both white people and people of color have these biases, but you see the disproportionate negative impact to children of color and not the majority population. We're not seeing white boys disproportionately disciplined or expelled in the data. So while implicit bias certainly contributes to increased stress in children of color, it's not the only cause of identity-based discrimination. So when we move on, there is this really beautiful pyramid developed by the RISE Center that sort of gives us some additional context to the original ACE study. So Melissa just went through this pretty iconic pyramid, and the next pyramid that you'll see has a couple of extra layers. So we know that our collective well-being depends on creating a foundation of health for all children. But it's important to recognize that other elements compromise healthy child development by producing toxic stress, like we just said. We know where a person lives has a crucial impact on their foundation for lifelong health. 70 to 90% of disease risks are attributed to the environment, not to genes. So where you live has a profound impact on your health across your lifespan. Many children are born into systems and structures that limit their opportunities to access safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments. These environments already have social and economic inequities. We can think about these inequities as being a series of locked doors for children of color. Some children and families have all the keys they need to access health care, safe parks, high-quality early child care, and stable housing. Many children, including disproportionately children of color, do not have keys to these locked doors. Census data show us that the poorest census tracts are, one, also the richest in the proportion of young children, and two, have the least realized social, physical, and educational, as well as economic capital. So three, we know that these poorest tracts are highly racially segregated and separated from many sources of economic opportunity. The implications are that our country's poorest neighborhoods require substantially more supports or keys to unlock doors for young children, but they currently have fewer. This would include individual services to young children and their families, but also publicly available services and voluntary supports, such as parks, playgrounds, and libraries. Increased family stress associated with a lack of resources, safety, and stability increases risk for exposure to toxic levels of stress in children. Elevated caregiver stress, as we've seen in previous slides, and instability makes it more challenging to have the psychological and financial capacity to engage in nurturing serve and return interactions with children. So as we compare the pyramid on the right with the pyramid on the left, we notice these two additional layers include generational embodiment and historical trauma and social conditions and local context. So the foundation really impacts a child's health in several ways. Many of the inequities we continue to see today are a result of structures that continue to exist generations later, including segregation we see for communities of color and barriers and locked doors to resources. Additionally, the science of epigenetics is beginning to demonstrate that exposure to trauma by previous generations can be passed down to future generations, compromising health. Next, we see, going up the pyramid, that there are these geographic or place inequities through social conditions and local context. As we see in the census data, the tracts with higher poverty have a much higher representation of children of color. These areas not only increase exposure to toxic stress because of compromised safety and lack of stability, but also locked doors that prevent access to those services, supports, and community environments that would offload stressors and promote health and resilience. As an example, the majority of young children of color who live in these low-income areas have working parents. Unfortunately, people of color are more likely to be employed in low-wage jobs that lack predictable schedules and benefits, such as paid time off. Lack of affordability and accessibility locks the door to high-quality early childhood education and care for these families. The result is a stressful, unpredictable, and unstable situation for many families. As a result of chronic exposure to stress and a lack of access to support, children of color are more likely to experience ACEs, such as having a parent with mental health issues or experiencing neglect. This stress certainly impacts the quality and availability of serve and return interactions. These conditions paint a picture of complex trauma that negatively impacts brain and body development. Increasingly, we still see children cope with this stress by adopting those unhealthy behaviors that increase the prevalence of disease, disability, criminalization, social problems, and eventual early death. Across the lifespan, the impact of overt racism and implicit bias and structural racism continue to contribute to chronic, high elevations of stress. These data suggest that improving child health trajectories and reducing health disparities according to race and socioeconomic status will require concerted individual effort as well as community building efforts directed to poor and usually racially segregated neighborhoods and communities. As a community, we can build a strong foundation for children of color who are overrepresented in poor outcomes by identifying keys to unlock these doors to health and well-being. So I want to walk through this pyramid really quickly, and we've kind of looked at those two underlying conditions there that lead to complex trauma and ACEs, right? So we have these social inequities where we don't have access to those supports and services that would help us really thrive and develop health and create health. And then the increased stress we face when we have these additional layers leads to a higher prevalence of ACEs, but you're not just looking at ACEs, you're looking at ACEs in addition to that complex trauma. And so moving up or in addition to the historical trauma rather, and the place-based inequities. So as you're moving up the pyramid, what you see there is allostatic load, disrupted neurological development. And don't get too hung up on the term allostatic load. It just means the load that we can bear, the stress load that we can bear, right? And so we all only have so much that we can take. And you can think about our ability to rebound from stress being like a rubber band, right? But over time, if we keep pulling on that rubber band, if we keep expanding that allostatic load, it's going to stretch out or it's eventually going to snap and break. My favorite thing about this new pyramid is this next red line that says cope. And so instead of adoption of health risk behaviors, it's naming it for what it is, which is literally we're coping with chronic stress. And so I kind of like to joke and say that we all have unhealthy ways that we cope with stress, right? So I will sometimes reach for a second glass of wine or a candy bar when I know that really what would be best for me is to eat a salad and go take a walk. But the reality is that I do both of those things, right? I have some unhealthy ways that I cope, and I have other healthy ways, tools in my toolbox that I use to cope. And a lot of kids and families who experience chronic stress, not only are they experiencing such a high level, but they don't have those other tools in their toolbox, right? Or even access to those tools. So if you think about a food desert, right, or an unsafe neighborhood, you can't just make a fresh salad. You can't just go for a walk, right? And also, when you think about being more and more and more stressed, the less likely you are to rely on those healthier coping mechanisms. So if you're uber stressed, you're more likely to go for the candy bar. And so moving up the pyramid, what you see is, again, I love the reframing of this, the burden of disease, distress, criminalization, and stigmatization. So it's like not only do we have all of this additional stress, we are also carrying the burden of disease and stigmatization and everything else that exists. as early as birth. We know that children of color, or especially Black children, are twice as likely to be born at a lower birth weight, and that's accounting for a mother's education background and socioeconomic status, right? And that's not the only area we see these disparities. We see them in every single area of health, well-being, and functioning. And then what you see at the very top of the pyramid, again, is early death. And so when we think about really meaningfully addressing ACEs and trauma in Tennessee, we have to be doing and both. We have to be addressing ACEs as they have conventionally stood, right? And we have to add in these layers of equity, social determinants or social influencers of health, and place-based discrimination, right? And we have to look at those things and reduce those stressors in order for us to decrease the toxic stress felt by all children. So one study that we have here really shows that the more risk factors that you have, the greater chance that you won't meet developmental milestones in your first 3 years. So you can see that when we start looking at 7 or more risk factors, we're talking about 100% developmental delay, not meeting milestones by age 3. So this has, this is again just another graph that demonstrates the profound influence of adversity in the earliest years of life. And again, how we see a lot of these kids not being able to necessarily reach their full potential because they didn't have access to those safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. This, again, is one of my very favorite. I'm a nerd, if you can't tell. I have a lot of favorite graphics in this presentation, but this oil spill graphic is probably my utmost favorite because it really shows us why this matters for all of us, okay? So people who have an ACE score of 0, because we all have an ACE score. We have one between 0 and 10, or if you add the additional, the expanded ACEs, it's going to be even higher, right? And so even if we have an ACE score of 0 and we think, oh, this doesn't really relate to me, it still does relate to you because ACEs compromise our health, our well-being, and our safety in our community. So the oil spill that you see here is the amount of each of these issues that's attributable to an ACE score of 4 or more at the population level, okay? So when you look here and you see cardiovascular disease, what this is essentially saying is that 25.5% of cardiovascular disease is attributable to an ACE score of 4 or more. Let's see, so 55.7% of anxiety, right? 59% almost of HIV, being high risk for HIV, is related or is connected to having an ACE score of 4 or more. So the power of this is here. How many billions of dollars and billions of hours do you think that we spend trying to solve just one area, one pie piece? And this isn't even all of the negative outcomes. I think there are just 10 on this graphic. And you think about sticking a paper towel in the middle of that oil spill to soak up that oil. That's what it would be to prevent adverse childhood experiences. We would see a simultaneous and relative reduction in every single one of these problem areas if we prevented ACEs in the first place. If we gave all children access to safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. And that would save us, again, billions of dollars, lots of time and energy trying to fix the problem on the back end. This is yet another graph that looks at 10 more. As Melissa said earlier, there are 42 plus, it just keeps growing, negative outcomes associated with adverse childhood experiences. But what you see here, again, when we look at things like incarceration or we look at painkillers to get high, we're seeing 50 and 60% of these issues, think about our opioid epidemic, that are attributable to an ACE score of 4 or more. So if you could hold in mind all of these issues that we are really trying to tackle as a community, as a state, as a nation, and if we got to the root cause of what's driving them, we would see a substantial decline in those issues, which is going to benefit every single one of us. In Tennessee, this looks very similar to a chart you saw maybe 5 slides back that looked at the original Kaiser Permanente study. And so Tennessee is one of 30 states that looks at adverse childhood experiences at the population level. And you see that our numbers fare pretty similar to the original Kaiser study 20 odd years ago. So 61% of the individuals in our population had at least one adverse childhood experience, reported that, and 28% reported 3 or more. So that's 1 in 4 individuals. The thing about the way we collect this data, it's called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. We call people up on their landlines or on their cell phones, and we ask them a slew of questions, not just the AIDS questions, but all kinds of questions about disease and health and habits and behaviors. And so what we know from this is that A, we're not reaching everybody, like we're not reaching very specific populations, which we'll talk about in just a second. But B, people aren't necessarily going to share all of their life story or all of the details of their adverse childhood experiences over the phone to a stranger. So we know that this is an underreport, and yet it's still incredibly high. Using that BRFIS data and looking at the relationship between ACE scores and the following, you can see that there is a real, these smart epidemiologists at the Department of Health look and see what's statistically significant and look to see what thing is actually related to another thing. And so when they looked at these conditions or behaviors, they found that they were related to this ACE score of 4 or more. So you see my little box is, oh, sugar. Okay, keeping me from seeing, there we go. So 49% of depression attributable to an ACE score of 4 or more. 32% of smoking, 24% of asthma, 21% of COPD, 13% of obesity, 13% of cardiovascular disease, 10% of diabetes, 5% of hypertension. And this is, again, looking at the data from 2014 to 2016, so relatively new, current data that shows us that we are really still struggling with this in our state, and that ACEs are a leading cause of some of our most chronic and challenging conditions. When we think about the economic impact of Tennessee, we have a partner, a nonpartisan, basically public policy think tank that exists here in Tennessee called the Sycamore Institute. So when they looked at this data, they tried to calculate what was the cost to business, right? Whether it be missed days of work or the cost of just these diseases. And they found that very conservatively, we know that ACEs cost Tennesseans $5.2 billion per year. And again, this isn't looking at things like crime or things like special education or, a lot of other, other mental health issues, right? This is just looking at these 8 or so outcomes. So we know that a good way to improve the prosperity of our state and improve the lives of everybody is just to get to the root cause of what's driving these community conditions. You heard me mention that the BRFIS questionnaire, the method that they use, does not get to all of the populations that experience adverse childhood experiences. So one of those populations that you might think of are folks who are incarcerated. They're not able to answer a phone call and answer several questions, and yet research continually shows us that those who are incarcerated experience much higher rates of adverse childhood experiences than the general population. So there's an organization, a nonprofit organization called the Family Center that serves Middle Tennessee. And they're in 3 or 4 jails. and they've distributed more than 1,700 ACE questionnaires in a trauma-informed way, because we do not advocate at the Commission, nor does Building Strong Brains encourage people to just hand out ACE questionnaires, right? There is a responsible way in which to do that. But when they handed this questionnaire out, what they found was that 74% of the individuals reported having an ACE score of 4 or more. When we compare that to the original Kaiser Permanente population, that original population, that only represented 13%. So you can see the real difference there. And then over 50% had an ACE score of 6 or more, which we know not only significantly increases risk of disease and disability, but also, on average, cuts our life short by 20 years. So what about like some of those other programs? Like it's pretty extreme to maybe look at folks who are incarcerated, because in many respects, whether it be because of traditional ACEs or conventional ACEs or expanded ACEs, they are incarcerated, right? They're living the outcome of a lifetime of trauma and stress. So when we think about those programs that are serving vulnerable folks, but they're not like at the level of being vulnerable as being incarcerated, we can begin to see that these folks, again, have a much higher ACE score than the general population. So evidence-based home visiting programs in our state are overseen by the Department of Health. That's who executes the contracts. And when they distribute the ACE questionnaire, what they see is that 26%, so 13% more than the original study, have an ACE score of 4 or more, and 12% have an ACE score of 6 or more. So even when we're talking about one risk factor, one thing that makes you eligible for a program like home visiting, you see an increased rate of adverse childhood experiences. Now, we're about to pivot, and I'm grateful for that. We're about to pivot to what can be done, where's the hope, all of that stuff, because so far it's been a little bit bleak. We've been talking about shortened lifespans and diseases and all kinds of things. So we kind of want to go from the macro, where we're looking at the population level and those population trends, to thinking about how that applies at the individual or micro level. So you see at the top here that we say ACEs are not destiny, right? That means you may have a high ACE score and you won't die 20 years younger, right? We don't want anyone leaving this presentation counting up in their brain how many ACEs they've experienced and thinking it's all over. Because there's a lot of variation from person to person. When you look at 17,000 people or 50,000 people or whatever population level that you're looking at people who represent a wide variety of that spectrum, and then you're looking at trends. But when you go to the individual level, there is going to be considerable variation. So you can't just get an ACE score and look at an individual and say, this is what's going to happen to you. So the first thing that you'll see there is that some children are more susceptible than others to toxic stress. And you will know this if you are a sibling or if you've ever had more than one child. I jokingly say that my sister is a very sensitive woman and was always a sensitive kid, and you could just look at her wrong and she would cry, right? Which made her very easy for my parents to discipline. And me, not so much, right? I didn't care how you looked at me. And so you can think about these kids as being like orchid kids or dandelion kids. So some kids, little bits of stress can really affect them, and some kids can withstand a whole heck of a lot, just like a dandelion, right? That they grow anywhere in a range of conditions versus an orchid needs a very specific set of conditions in order to thrive, okay? Not to survive, but thrive. So there are different temperaments that children have, and so they respond to stress differently. Most kids are going to fall on a spectrum between dandelion and orchid, but you can kind of sense where they are on that spectrum. A thing I want to note, though, here is also to talk about orchid kids in a really positive way, because I think that we have some negative perceptions of sensitive kids in our society. And what I will say is that not only are these orchid kids more sensitive to stress, they're also more sensitive to positive conditions. So there are kids who really, really thrive and are really beautiful when and do better than average when they are given that optimal set of conditions. So they just kind of have bigger range. The other thing that I'll say is that we know, all of us have probably experienced an adult or another caregiver besides our parents who played a buffering, caring role. So kids who may be struggling with adversity at home, when they have a grandma or a neighbor or a teacher or a child care worker who spends a lot of time with them and provides them that safe, stable, nurturing relationship and environment, it is going to act as a buffer to that stress and make it less toxic. We also know that there's opportunity to repair damage across development from early childhood through adulthood. And so if there weren't that opportunity, then we shouldn't invest in any of our therapies or any of our interventions. But we know that they work, right? It's going to take maybe more effort when you're 50 or 60 years old, but we can still heal and repair. The body wants to heal from those traumatic experiences. The younger, the better, but it's never too late. And then just to emphasize that point, interventions at any point in childhood or adulthood make a difference. So please don't leave this presentation saying, well, this kid is over the age of 5 or over the age of 20. There's no hope, right? There's always hope, and it's always worth investing in the healing of somebody who has experienced trauma, not only because they themselves will have a better trajectory for the rest of their lives, but also because we live in community, many of these adults are caregivers to other children, right? They are raising the next generation, and if we can help them be thriving, healthier, and resilient, they're going to raise the next generation of healthy, thriving, resilient children. So one thing when folks learn about adverse childhood experiences is they say, we have to start an ACEs program, right? And at TCCY, we like to say a lot of what we've already been doing has been mitigating or preventing ACEs. In some cases, we need to tweak it or enhance it. In some cases, it's just about scaling it up, like evidence-based home visiting, making it more widely available to the population who could benefit from it. So we already know what helps children develop well, what helps them build strong brain architecture and resilience over time. And these are things like early support for emotional, social, and cognitive and language development, supportive relationships with adults and caregivers and opportunities to learn from infancy to young adulthood, highly specialized early interventions for children and families experiencing significant adversity. So if we notice early on that there's something going on and we give a specialized intervention, we are setting that family up and that child up for success for the long haul. And then lastly, we want to see opportunities to build executive functioning skills across childhood and adolescence. And if we have adults who missed the opportunity to build those, we can still build them in adulthood. All right, we're going to watch this video about resilience really quickly. So full disclosure, I forgot how long that little song goes on. It makes it just a little bit awkward when I'm trying to transition back to the presentation. So, the thing about resilience that I am most excited to share is that we can build it, right? As you see from that video, what we do today, the services, the supports, and the environments in which children are raised really have a profound effect on their outcomes later in life. So let's review a couple of these key concepts. So when we think about the scale, right, it's really counter to what a lot of people think about, or the metaphors that a lot of people use when they think about resilience. So you hear those metaphors like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There's a new one that I've heard a couple years ago called, or it says, if you get thrown off the horse 7 times, get on again, or get on 8, or something like that. So anyway, there's a lot of these this belief system that if we go inside and we have enough grit, that we can overcome this. And that's really excluding the role and all the science that demonstrates how impactful relationships and environments are, not only on the way in which our brain is literally constructed, but also on the health and wellness and development of lots of our systems in our body. And so when we think about the scale, it gives us a more dynamic approach. It weaves in a lot of the science that's pretty complex in a way that's a little simpler to understand. Another thing that I'll share is that our friends at the Frameworks Institute who work with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, they have this little quote that says, what doesn't kill you may actually kill you, right? So it may not kill you today, but it could shorten your lifespan by 20 years. We need to remember that. So when you think about a scale, it would seem that just having positive or negative experiences would be the thing that would tip it in one way or the other. And certainly it has a huge impact. But there's also something that's a part of the scale called the fulcrum. This may not have been a term you've used since 8th grade geometry, but it is essentially the scale's tipping point. And wherever that fulcrum is placed determines how easily the scale tips to one side or the other. So you see the initial placement of the fulcrum right now in the image that you're seeing right now makes it easier for this scale to tip towards negative outcomes. So if you think about a child who is more of an orchid child, more of a sensitive child, where those outcomes really affect them, you can have the same positive experiences and the same negative experiences, but those negative experiences are going to tip the scale towards negative outcomes. I often share, I have a 6-year-old, and when he was born, he was a pretty sensitive baby. So he didn't sleep well, he had eating issues, all kinds of things. And so it didn't take a lot, right, for him to get dysregulated and get upset. So this is where the next piece of the puzzle comes in, and thank God for it, right? Because that fulcrum, as we saw in the video, we can shift it during those sensitive periods of development. So when we co-regulate, which basically means that when our child is dysregulated, when we're the bigger, stronger, wiser, kinder, calm adult that helps them calm down over and over again, we are building the internal capacity for that child to have their own coping skills by modeling that, right? And helping them come down from being really escalated or dysregulated. And so when we do that over and over again, when we teach healthy coping skills, like naming our feelings, so instead of hitting, saying, I feel frustrated, and that takes a lot of practice. Don't think you can do it once and be done with it. But as we say, you seem mad because you're crying and you're hitting and you're screaming, right? Then we're naming those emotions, which is an important piece of self-regulation, because as our as our wonderful researcher friend, Dr. Daniel Siegel says, when you can name it, you can tame it, right? So we're engaging those more complex parts of our neural development of our brain that help us regulate our behavior and calm down. So when we're doing that in early childhood, when we're providing children with safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments most of the time, and again, when the brain is very plastic in adolescence, right, where we're building a lot of those more complex executive functioning skills and we're supporting the development of those things, we are actually pushing the fulcrum to a more advantageous place where it is harder to tip towards negative outcomes, right? So the cumulative impact of those positive life experiences and coping skills shift the fulcrum's position, making it easier to achieve positive outcomes. So I tell, early Head Start and Head Start teachers and early childhood educators, I say, you are not just educating or building the brains of the next generation, right? You are literally building resilience in such a way that it is going to have lasting lifetime effects in this child's life and in the lives of everybody else that this child touches, right? So when you're long gone and this child is 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, they will still be benefiting from the health and well-being that you created and developed in those earliest years. Same for people like Melissa who are working with adolescents. When you're working with those adolescents, you are having such a dramatic impact on their lifelong health because of the brain plasticity that's going on. Again, that's not to discount people who are working with other age ranges, right? Because again, we all live in community, and most of the time, all of the time, we are going to benefit when somebody else is doing well, when they are resilient, but especially the next generation that they are raising are going to learn those skills early on and not need the later intervention, likely. And so I say all this to say that the nice thing about a scale is that even if you have an adult, even if you have somebody who's 40, 50, 60 years old, who's showing up, who is really struggling, and you're really thinking to yourself, this person is showing me very little resilience. They're reacting really strongly. They don't have good control of their emotions. They have a hard time understanding consequences, right, or resisting impulsive decisions, whatever's going on, okay? You can think back to that scale and you can think in your mind that the scale probably, you can see my little arrow, I think, the scale looks like this, like this, where there's a lot of negative outcomes, where their fulcrum's not in a great place. But we can still tip the scale. It's just going to take a lot more resources, right? We are going to have to weigh down the positive side of that scale very, very heavy in order for it to tip back toward those positive outcomes. But it is certainly doable and very much worthwhile. Getting back to that expanded ACEs and that expanded pyramid that we looked at, again, we have to think about the unique challenges and conditions that are faced by children of color to building resilience. So we know that Black and brown children are more likely to experience systemic barriers to building resilience. As we said before, you can think about them as being locked doors. So disproportionately, they are living in communities without access to resources and safe, stable, nurturing environments. Disproportionately, their parents are not paid as well, don't have jobs with the same kinds of benefits, and experience, on the whole, much more stress. Not only because of systemic barriers, but also because of overt racism and implicit bias, right? So there are lots and lots and lots of locked doors and sources of stress for children of color, right? So we, in our approach here in Tennessee, have to think very specifically about the additional supports and services that we need to concentrate in those areas. We need to look at those areas where children don't have access, and we need to say, what is it that I would want for my child, right? I want health care for my child. I want my child to have nutritious food. I want my child to live in a safe neighborhood. I want my child to have access to dental cleanings and those kinds of things. Because I know, and not to mention high quality, affordable childcare, right? Which mine wasn't very affordable, but I could afford it, right? But many people couldn't. And then a high quality school, like a public school. And so my child has had the benefit of having those things, and I have prioritized those things because I know how important they are for his development so he can succeed well in life. So where the data shows us that those are not the experiences that children have, that they don't have the same resources and access, that is where they're going to need more resources and access to tip the scale towards positive outcomes, right? Because we're not just dealing with lack of resources. We are also dealing with generations that disproportionately had less access to wealth, to health, and well-being, right? And so there's a few other layers that we need to consider in our state when we're thinking about children of color specifically, or zip codes, neighborhoods, or communities that have high poverty. Again, getting back to what is it that we want for all children. We want all children, you've heard us say it probably 27 times at this point, safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. But we're going to define what we really mean by that. Safe means free from physical and emotional harm. Stable means familiar routines, people, and places. And nurturing means to sensitively care for and encourage healthy development. Okay, and so when children have these things in their lives, they are able to flourish. They are able to be amazingly resilient, not only when they have them early in life, but if they consistently have them through their lives, right? So that tells us that when we have the scale that is stacked in such a way where there's lots and lots of positive experiences and the fulcrum has been moved, like we've literally changed the genetic or the biological, a child's biological ability to be resilient, right? When we've done all those things, when the hardships come, when they're adults, they bounce off, just like we saw in that video, right? And that is the very definition of resilience. We want those hardships to be able to be experienced and then to be able to be overcome because we have this lifetime, this good foundation of built resilience that helps us succeed and thrive. A lot of people, just to relate it very quickly to COVID right now, a lot of people are worried, right, about the impact of COVID-19 on children. And what we like to remind people is that absolutely, this is going to increase stress for families, particularly those families who already disproportionately have lack of access to resources, right, that were in inflexible jobs without paid benefits, that cannot work from home, those kinds of things. Yes, that is going to provide more stress. For parents who are stressed themselves, right, but are giving themselves grace and are doing the best they can, this is going to be a tolerable stressor for their kids, right? So I like to jokingly say that, we're a little bit more bickery than we would be normally here in the household, having spent 3 months together. But I'm apologizing a lot more to my child, and I'm having way more snuggles, and I'm having lots of connected time, right? And all of that is the stuff that's going to buffer him from experiencing chronic or toxic stress related to COVID-19. So while we've got our work cut out for us for other children who really, and families who really have felt the stress and hardship of this time, don't think that every child is going to walk away from this experience traumatized. This will be a tolerable stress for many, many children. All right, moving on. Another thing that we can do to build resilience is build that air traffic control system, build those executive functioning skills. So another one of our favorite researchers, Dr. Judy Cameron, says we want to make this as fun as possible. We want to make it a game. We want to make it rewarding. Kids do better when they are learning in a fun way, in a way that motivates them to continue on their own or engage regularly, than if we're trying to shove it down their throats, right? So when we're thinking about focusing attention, problem solving, planning ahead, behavior regulation, controlling impulses, adjusting to new circumstances, when we are building that capability, we are moving the fulcrum in a positive direction. We are helping children build coping skills, and we are helping them build resilience. So people think, well, how would you make that fun? Okay, it might be something like if we're going to play a game of Uno, right, or a strategic game in some form or fashion, that's helping the child plan ahead, remember the rules, and make it fun for them, right? And there are lots of other things that we can do to do that, whether it be a sport, whether it be learning an instrument, or other things that, it's going to be unique for every single child. But there are lots and lots of ways that we can build this, and we want to scaffold as adults. And we want to remember at all times that young children and even adolescents are not adults. They have not mastered these things yet. Sometimes they can show up very well regulated and seem like they've got it under control. And other times we're bewildered when we have a 15 or 16-year-old who throws a tantrum like a 2-year-old, right? We're like, yesterday or even 5 minutes ago, you seemed to be very mature and have it together. Well, that is just a real symptom of this, that this is underdeveloped, right? That we're still mastering these skills, and it's going to take time. It's going to take reinforcement from adults in order to build them. So how are we going to fix this problem? We know that we can build health in children. We know we can build resilience in children, and we know we do that by preventing toxic stress through providing safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. This is going to take some collective ingenuity. We are still struggling with a lot of the aftermath of toxic stress here in Tennessee, but this is a solvable problem. We can come together, we can use collective impact, we can learn from our previous successes and from existing research, and we can develop new innovative interdisciplinary strategies to really tackle this problem. And when we put in the effort to come up, to use our collective ingenuity and to come up with some of these better strategies, we're going to see the needle move not just a little bit, like we've seen in a lot of instances throughout the years. We're going to see the needle move a lot, right? Because we're going to be getting to the root cause of what's driving the issues that we face as a state. So I'm going to start really big and kind of go to sort of big, sort of medium, but I'm not getting to that clinical level, that individual level, very much in this part of the presentation. There is so much more that you can learn on acesconnection.com, or if you just Google adverse childhood experiences, it will take you down a rabbit hole, and we literally could make this a 7-day training if we encompassed everything that needed to happen. So we're going to be taking that big picture approach through the rest of this presentation. But we hope that you will be able to think about how this applies to you, whether you're a teacher, a church member, a parent yourself, a grandparent, a Rotary Club member, a business owner, whoever you are. We hope that you can take this information and really think about how you can change your policies, your philosophy, your practices, your programs, et cetera. So the first thing that we really have to do when we're thinking about our collective ingenuity is take a primary prevention approach, which is something we don't often do. I'm going to have us map on this little image or this graph onto a public health approach that most of us have experienced, which is the effort to reduce the smoking culture in the U.S. So when you think about if you're my age or older, you will remember times where you could smoke in restaurants, right? You will remember the time where they moved it to being a smoking section of the restaurant. You will remember all of the ads that popped up on TV, all of the commercials about the impact on lungs and people who experience cancer. You will remember all of the campaigns that existed in your public schools, right? This is what we mean by primary prevention. it was everywhere. You're not going to go up to a smoker and say, did you know that could give you cancer? And then be shocked, right? They know, right? They know the outcomes. We all know 2 or 3 diseases that we can associate with smoking, and it's because we've put a lot of effort into primary prevention. We've put a lot of effort into everybody knowing that smoking is bad for you, everyone knowing diseases that are associated with smoking, right? And we've seen policy shifts, right, as a result of that collective common awareness. The policy shifts were things like you can't smoke inside the building. You can't even smoke on the campus. We're going to increase the taxes for smoking, right, and make it more cost prohibitive. And then those 2 things combined, the raising awareness and the policy shift, really led to a norms change. So if you were a child of the 70s or even the 80s or 60s or earlier, and somebody was smoking next to you, your parent wouldn't have said, move away from my child, right? They would have maybe, if they were concerned about the dangers of secondhand smoke, they might have moved their child away, but they wouldn't have asked the other adult to move away. Now it is no problem for a parent to say, get that cancer stick away from my child, right? We see a real norms change in our culture as a result of that primary prevention efforts. Unfortunately, we do not invest in these kinds of primary prevention efforts at the rate we ought to, nationally or here in Tennessee, right? We've begun to do some really good work in primary prevention efforts. Building Strong Brains is training being one of the things that we do. But certainly you will know that if you walk out into your community and ask somebody who is not in this field, if they know what adverse childhood experiences are and 2 diseases that are associated with them, they can't tell you, right? We are missing a real piece of this puzzle of informing everyone in the population about the impact of adverse childhood experiences and everyone on the diseases associated with them and everyone on ways that we can improve outcomes. Right now, what we primarily as a country invest in is tertiary prevention, which is those treatment services. The CDC tells us we will never, ever have enough money to address all of the outcomes of adverse childhood experiences. So while we don't need to get rid of treatment services by any means, perhaps we need to even scale some of that up, we need to be meaningfully at the same time investing in those primary prevention efforts in order to really shift the culture. Because the truth is that there are more diseases associated with ACEs than there are with smoking. And when you look at smoking behavior, increased ACEs increases the likelihood you're going to smoke or pick up that cigarette in the first place to cope with your stress. Okay, so we need to give this the same attention, if not more attention, as we've given other public health issues. One thing that everybody can do is adopt the 4 R's from SAMHSA, which is a federal organization that has really done a lot of work in this. And so they say we need to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand the potential paths for recovery. Another important thing that we need to focus on there, we need to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system. And then we have to respond by fully integrating that knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, which in turn will actively seek to resist re-traumatization. So I'm going to translate this a little bit to what does this look like in real life. So I'll give you an example of one program who has integrated this into their work. And that is a lot of the work with trauma-informed schools. They're recognizing that lots of their kids have experienced ACEs and trauma. And that recognition is ensuring that their policies, procedures, and practices are changing. So one policy would be, we're not going to get in a kid's face when they're escalated and yell at them, right? we are going to help them co-regulate. We're going to send them to a peace corner. We are going to do some other kind of intervention that helps them get back down to a regulated state where they can think rationally, because we know that kids that are stressed out, that are reactive, they're unable to learn, right? They're not even able to learn from the experience, right? And so a lot of teachers, too, will recognize that kids who have experienced trauma, maybe you don't sneak up behind them accidentally, and tap them on the shoulder. Maybe you let them know verbally you're coming in advance. And what are those things that we can do that keep kids engaged in school, see it as a safe place, so that we're not following the norm, which is that zero tolerance policy of disciplining and expelling kids who are acting the way they're acting because they've experienced trauma, and now we're traumatizing them further, and we're decreasing access to those safe, stable, nurturing environments. That would help mitigate the experience, right? Schools can be a real place of healing if we understand the role that trauma plays. And so you see a lot of those teachers and principals actively resist re-traumatization and recognize that students' behavior is not a personal attack on them. It is an adaptive response to what they've grown up in. We can adopt a lot of these principles for trauma-informed approach, which includes promoting safety, trustworthiness, empowerment, collaboration, peer support, and consider history, gender, and culture when we're thinking about our trauma-informed approaches. And you can look up more into that on SAMHSA's website. Another thing we have to do is move not just to prevention, but primary prevention, right? We know that the brain's capacity to change, as Melissa taught us early on in this presentation, that it's easiest to change it when we have those 1 million new neural connections forming every single second, when the brain is very plastic. That's where we need to be spending our money. Yet where we do spend our money is later on down the road when it takes a lot more effort, okay? So let's invest in the front end where we can really create health and make a change, in addition to investing on the back end, but eventually we won't need to invest nearly as much on the back end if we give every kid what they need to begin with to thrive and to flourish. We see the science really pan out with this. Nobel Prize laureate, prize-winning economist James Heckman shows us that when we invest in the earliest years of life, that we see almost a $7 return on our investment. So every dollar you invest, you get a $7.40 return, which is a net of $6.40. Which is a lot of money. It's better than you can do in the stock market. So the time is early on. But also, don't forget it's never too late. And this is a pretty static graph, but if you think about two-generation approaches that focus on these later years of job training and supports for parents, and this birth to 5 period, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck by approaching that through a two-generation strategy. Again, this just is looking at very specific programs and the returns on investments that they provide. These are evidence-based programs that do target those earliest years of life. Another thing that we want to do is really to create lots of charging stations in our communities for kids. So kids need places to plug up and charge in order to contribute to the learning, contribute to their own development, right? And we can think about it being like a cell phone or an iPad or computer, that you're not going to be able to function very well if you don't have places to plug in and charge up. So we need communities to have places, or not only high quality K through 12 schools that are safe, but green spaces, museums, libraries, grocery stores, boys and girls clubs, churches, lots of places where kids can plug in, connect, recharge, and have opportunities to have the types of relationships that are going to build strong green architecture. we're getting a little close to time, and I want to have time to answer some questions. So I am just going to very quickly say that I'm not going to show this video, but I'll describe it. One thing that we also know is that we want to support mental levelness for kids, and all of us have mental health, right? But sometimes we notice in children early on that there are little wobbles with behavior, with just challenges and functioning. And when we start to notice those little wobbles early on, you can think about the levelness of the table. If you can get somebody to figure out what's going on and put a little sugar packet underneath that table and stop the wobble, it will make that table level and able to function, right? But the table can't wobble itself. So we can't ask a child who's struggling with mental health challenges or little wobbles to fix that wobble. They need the support of other people. You can think about your Tennessee early intervention system, where they have occupational therapy or physical therapy for kids early on, and then it improves a lifetime of functioning for that child because we're getting in young. As I said before, there are lots of ways that we can build executive functioning. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child has a guidebook of ways that you can do this from birth all the way through adolescence. And so these are just some of the ways that you can build that functioning. I do want to point out that when we say computer games, we don't mean put your kid in the basement to play Halo or Fortnite for 5 hours at a time. We really are talking about those games that are more strategic in nature, and maybe you, the parent, can engage with them as well to help build that brain circuitry, but not, again, for hours on end. I mentioned a two-generation approach. So one of the most effective ways that we support prevention of ACEs is by helping parents and helping caregivers, not just parents, but caregivers, anybody who interacts with a child, to be the healthiest version that they can be, because they are the ones that are building the brain architecture in these kids. And so we want to make sure that we are decreasing stress and increasing skills for caregivers so that they can engage in this sometimes challenging game of circle and return interactions. Lastly, if we think about the expanded ACE pyramid and we think about the barriers that children experience when we're looking at the resilience scale, when we're thinking about children of color, we have to look at adverse community environments. So what are those things that are really driving ACEs, what we see above ground, so to speak? They are things like poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunity, poor housing quality, right? So these adverse community environments are the things that produce adverse childhood experiences. And we can't begin to eliminate or reduce ACEs without looking at improving the quality of those environments. So when we think about the sort of obvious things that we can do to address ACEs, they are things like substance abuse services and domestic violence services. But we must also consider things like public housing, employment opportunities, child care supports, especially now where lots of child care agencies are struggling, affordable housing, et cetera. These are the things that produce healthy environments that decrease stress and increase access to resources and opportunity that are going to help families and community members thrive. Again, there are many things that we can adopt, and I honestly, we're kind of getting at time here, so I am going to just briefly hit on a couple of these, but we've already talked about high quality, affordable child care. We've talked about things like home visiting, evidence-based home visiting to support new parents with new caregivers with infants and young children. Things like integrated health care, where we weave in behavioral and mental health supports in addition to physical health, in a primary care setting. We've talked about trauma-informed policies and practices. One thing I will point out here is infant and early childhood mental health services and supports. They're really those things that get at the little wobbles early. And so when we notice that there are attachment issues or challenges or early concerning behavior, it is those clinical approaches that work with the infant and the caregiver to support healthy attachment that ultimately results in health. Things like health system community, investment in community. So we talked about how 70 to 90% of disease derives from those social determinants or influencers, if you will, of health. And so when we invest in improving the conditions of the community, we decrease the tax and toll on the healthcare system. So there's lots that we can do. And we've talked pretty extensively about, these are our 4 Ps for building strong brains. And so we've talked pretty extensively about not just changing, professional practice, but we want to get down all the way to the level of your philosophy. We want your philosophy to be informed by this science that will then ripple out and change the way, change policies and change funding and eventually change programs and services or improve them, and also change professional practice. We need to be doing all of these things at once in order to change the culture in our state. And around the 4 Ps, you see lots and lots of different sectors. And just like changing a culture of smoking did not just come from doctors, changing a culture around adverse childhood experiences can't just come from doctors, can't just come from mental health practitioners or child advocates. It has to come from the faith community. It has to come from corrections. It has to come from the media, right, in order to generate this broad awareness and this broad response that will meaningfully shift the needle. So at the end of the day, we are asking you to, if you walk away with nothing else, right, if you walk away with changing your question, changing your perspective from what is wrong with you to what happened to you, right? Any of you in a relationship will know that if you say, what is wrong with you? Your partner is not going to say, that's a great question, right? Let me think deeply about that. They're going to get defensive and it's not going to be productive. But when we are thinking about children and clients and families and even the person in the grocery store who is struggling, right? Maybe they're yelling or demonstrating a negative behavior. If we move from what is wrong with you to what happened to you, we become more open, we become more empathetic, and we become curious, right? Which really helps us to drive change and be productive. What's wrong with you doesn't give opportunity for us to improve these conditions. What happened to you does invite us to all participate in making the community a healthier place for all children and families. So with that, I'm going to stop. You can go to our website, by the way, at tn.gov/TCCY to find more information. And we would ask that you please fill out this survey after this presentation and let us know how we did. We always are seeking to improve and make this as relevant as possible. So with that, I'm 2 minutes to time, but I'm happy to stick around to answer questions longer than 3:30.
Thank you, Jan. And I'm going to let Christy hop on just to do some closing, and then for folks that need to get off, and then we'll we have a couple of questions that came in, and I'll ask those.
Okay. Well, thank you, Melissa, for the excellent presentation. I know I always learn something every single time I hear it. So on behalf of all the regional coordinators, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, engaging in this wonderful presentation. All recordings will be available on our TCCY website at tn.gov/TCCY. Under the Publications tab, you can click on videos. So as a quick reminder, if you are calling in today and need a CEU certificate or a certificate of participation, please email Susan Cope, that's COPE @tn.gov, with your name and the phone number. All attendees will be receiving an email next week with certificates and membership information about joining our local councils. So for those of you who need to leave us, we thank you again for joining. And for those that can remain, I'll turn it back to you, Jen, for some questions.
And Melissa, by the way. Yeah, I should have said her too, if she's able to stay.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll turn it back to you and Melissa.
Great, thank you. Jen, Melissa, do you mind to go a little bit more into, there's a question, does trauma cause mental health issues?
I'll let Melissa take a first stab at this if she wants to.
I think the key is what you see in the ACEs study is it can create unhealthy coping mechanisms, which potentially could lead to mental health concerns when it's unmitigated. And so I think the important thing is to know that there are things that can be done to prevent moving all the way down that road, if that's the right way to say that. But having exposure to adversity in childhood or any sort of trauma in childhood, or even as we get older, can definitely create symptoms that could lead to mental health concerns for sure.
Yeah, and I just echo exactly what Melissa said. I will say that when we look at the outcomes of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, mental health outcomes and substance abuse outcomes are among the worst. And so we do know that mental health issues are a confluence, right? If you think about that scale or you think about the interaction of nature versus nurture, it's really going to be about a number of things. It's going to be about maybe the type of trauma, your available supports, when did it happen, what does your biology or your genetics look like. There are several factors at play, but when you have adversity, it does increase your chances for struggling with mental health and substance abuse considerably.
Thank you. The next one is, one of my moms asked me if she should use baby talk to communicate with her infant, or if talking like she normally would with an adult to her infant would help the infant learn more vocabulary. What do you suggest, or what is most beneficial for the infant to connect those neurons to learn vocabulary?
I love this question. Okay, there we go. I think there's still some echo. There we go. So this question is fascinating. There's a lot of science around baby talk, and it is actually called mother-ease, right? So the way in which we engage in the higher-pitched sing-song voice, you know, with a lot of the funny words that we use that aren't really words, they actually do promote the development of vocabulary, right? They get babies' attention, and we do it without thinking a lot of times, but there's a real biological reason that we do it. So certainly you can use regular words, but also, you know, using that mother-ease, that sing-song voice and those funny words, build attachment connection and engage in a more robust serve and return interaction. So I would say keep going with the mother-ease, you know, it is not going to hurt.
Thank you. That's good to know. I'm glad that didn't go with when my child was younger, that I didn't baby talk for nothing. Are there measures in place to take data after policies are put into place, or when will the data be reported?
Yeah, so we're early on in this, and I'm jumping in, and I can't see Melissa. So Melissa, I'm sorry if I'm dominating too much. You just tell me.
You're okay.
Okay, cool. There are big P and little p policies. So there are big P policies like increasing high quality pre-K, right? And even though people don't necessarily think that that's related to ACEs, it absolutely is. And so all of the data related to access to healthcare, access to high quality affordable childcare, all of those studies demonstrate that when we invest in policies that are good for kids and youth, that they have beneficial outcomes. To get more specific around trauma and ACEs, there are more little p policies that have been enacted around trauma and ACEs, and that data is just now being collected. So, of course, there is treatment data around trauma interventions that probably Melissa could speak to a lot more than I could, and employing those evidence-based approaches as a policy. Like that can be an organizational policy or it can be a state policy, right, in terms of reimbursement for contracts. But also, there are policies like I keep going to trauma-informed schools, where we do see in these schools that are adopting these practices a significant decline in escalating behaviors, in discipline referrals to the principal's office, and exclusionary discipline practices like expulsion, right? So the data is coming, and it really depends on how you're looking at this. But you know, you can do some preliminary research. Melissa, would you add anything to that?
No, I think you're good. Yeah, it's going to be very much a piece together kind of thing. There's probably not an overarching database, right? I mean, or mega analysis, I guess I should probably say. But you can search into some of the different procedures and protocols and get a lot of good information.
Well, I did a last call for questions. I think that's all we have. We've gotten some great feedback, how knowledgeable the two of you are. So we thank you so much for your time.
Hey, Jill, I saw a question about, can you have ACEs if you're not a person of color or something like that? Do all of us have ACEs, ACE scores, no matter our color or the environment in which we were reared in?
Okay, I didn't get that question. So
I just happened to, I didn't see the ones you found, so it works that we're together.
Okay.
Jen, I'll let you take a stab at that.
Okay, yeah, so we know, just like with all of the other outcomes, that children of color have disproportionately more adverse childhood experiences and stress. However, that original study, as Melissa talked about with Kaiser Permanente and CDC, those were mostly white individuals. 75% of them reported being Caucasian. And then when you look at Tennessee, which demographically is mostly made up of Caucasian citizens, we still see pretty high ACE scores. We see that they are common. But again, we're getting back to disproportionality or disparity, right, where we see that there is disparate stress and disparate negative or adverse experiences that children of color have. So it's and both. They are incredibly common no matter your gender, race, class, or socioeconomic status or community. But the reality is if you are raised in a community with more resources, you have more opportunities to buffer those types of stress. So you may, for instance, be growing up in a home that's very wealthy, but maybe you experience some ACEs with your parents, right? But then you go to high-quality childcare or high-quality schools, and those well-paid, well-resourced teachers buffer those experiences and support your development. And so it's not only about exposure to stress, it's also about exposure to resources. So very generally, ACEs are common. More specifically, we have some disparity.
Thank you, Jen.
did you all see any other questions? Sometimes they can come to you all.
I did not.
Okay.